Hello, and welcome to this screencast about evaluating generalizability, or how we apply studies that we're reading to the work we're actually doing in the field. So the first thing we need to talk about when we think about evaluating generalizability is sampling. So as you remember, sampling is the way we find a group of people to be in the study who may or may not represent the overall population. And so you can think of this as a progression. So say we have a population, which can be anything. It can be the entire population of the United States, or the population of people who are suffering from depression, or the population of people who live in a town or attend a school. So this is a large group. And in most research, it would not be practical to survey every single or collect data from every single member of that group. There's just too many people. So even in a relatively small population, like all the students at a high school, it still might not be practical or affordable to collect data from, say, all 800 students who go to that school. So within that population, we develop what's called a sampling frame. So the sampling frame is when we develop inclusion criteria and exclusion criteria. In other words, within that large population of people who go to the school, we've decided that we only want to survey people in 10th grade. So the inclusion criteria are the set of conditions you need to meet to be included in the sampling frame or eligible for the study is being a 10th grader. And let's say we also only have the capacity to interview or survey people who speak sufficient English. We don't have the capacity to survey people in other languages. So not speaking English sufficiently well to answer the questions becomes what's called an exclusion criteria, or something that means you can't, you're not eligible to participate. Because in this hypothetical study, we don't have the capacity to give the survey in other languages. So that's our sampling frame. And then so within that sampling frame, that smaller group of people who meet the criteria for being included, we're going to pick, say, 50 students rather than surveying all, 200 people who are in the grade. So the sample is a smaller group who is actually selected. So we might offer participation to everyone within the sampling frame, but the sample is only the people who actually end up being in the study. The sample is sometimes also called a sample population. And so a few terms we need to know about this. The first one is representativeness. And representativeness talks about how well the sample, the people that we picked, actually represent the larger population. And one thing to know about that is that larger samples are usually more representative, more like the actual population. And the reason for that is in a small sample, let's say we were only surveying 10 students, and one person was what's called an outlier, or their answers were very different from other people's. If we're only surveying 10 students, that one person who's an outlier is 10% of the sample and kind of carries more weight than they would in a larger sample where they were one of 50 or one of 100 or even one of 1,000. Their data would count for less because there's more people to kind of balance it out. So in general, random sampling is thought to make samples more representative. So in random sampling, every person within the sampling frame has an equally likely chance of being selected to participate using different ways of randomizing this. So like picking numbers out of a hat or having a computer program that selects every 10th person or something like that. There's some arguments for non-random sampling too, particularly in qualitative data collection, where we often use what's called purposive sampling, or we select, rather than random people, we select people who we think might have the most experience of the topic we're interested in, or have the most to say about it, based on our knowledge of the community or the population. So generalizability is also called, oh, that's an error. It should say external validity. Internal validity is bias and how well the study sort of works internally to make sure that it's not introducing bias or check itself against bias. We're talking about external validity or generalizability. And so the technical definition is the extent to which a study's findings are applicable or relevant to a group outside of the study. So in other words, how much what we learn about that small sample of people who are actually selected, how much we can apply those findings to all people in the sampling frame and all people in the population. So let's say, going back to that example where we excluded people who didn't speak English well enough to answer the questions we were asking. So we, in other words, people who didn't speak English weren't eligible. The generalizability is looking at how well the sample of people who only spoke English applies to both the sampling frame, people who, students who only spoke English, and also how well this sample, our small group, applies to the population, which includes students who speak English, as well as students who don't speak English and speak other languages. So we're looking at whether this sample matches the overall population, or applies to the overall population. So whether what we learn about this small group is also true of the larger group. In this case, all students in the school. So generalizability is often related to sampling. So the idea, particularly in traditional research methods and random sampling, is that if we do a good job at sampling, our sample, the group of people who were chosen, will relate to the overall population. So what's true of the sample will be true of the overall population. So another thing that you should be aware of is what's called selection bias. And so selection bias is a threat to internal validity. And it also has impacts for external validity or generalizability. So in selection bias, we're talking now about the sampling frame. So people who are selected from the sample are somehow categorically different from those who are eligible, people who meet inclusion criteria but are not selected. So in other words, if selection bias is at play, there's something that's happening that means that people who are selected are categorically different from people within the sampling frame, or people who meet the criteria and are eligible for being in the sample. So an example of this is, let's say I was doing a study about access to contraception. And my inclusion criteria are you have to be a cisgender adult who's aged 18 to 45 and who identify as heterosexual. So that's my sampling frame. In other words, people who are eligible to participate are cis adults who are straight. And so let's say I recruit in a family planning clinic waiting room. So there's categorically something different about the cisgender adults who identify as straight and who are in a sexual and reproductive health clinic waiting room. They might be different from people who are also cisgender adults who are also straight but don't have access to contraception. So this means because I'm recruiting in a family planning clinic waiting room, I might not be getting great information about access to contraception, since my sampling method and my recruitment strategy is categorically excluding people who don't have access to family planning clinics. Keep in mind, though, that just because a sample isn't representative of the entire population, that doesn't mean there's necessarily selection bias. So let's say I find a better way to recruit for my study about access to contraception. For example, calling every 10th person in the phone book and asking them if they're an adult who identifies as cisgender and straight. So in that case, there wouldn't be any selection bias at play. But my sample still wouldn't be representative of the entire population because there's many, many people in the US population, or the total population of the world, who are not cisgender and straight. So a lack of representativeness isn't necessarily selection bias, but selection bias definitely can contribute to a lack of representativeness. And so selection bias is a type of sampling error. And sampling error is a general term for when the sample doesn't match the population. And again, this is more likely in small samples. And so if you're studying homelessness, for example, and your study is set up so that you call people on landline phones, you might get a lot of sampling error, and you probably have selection bias at play contributing to that sampling error. So let's talk now about what happens when you have a study and you're wondering if the findings of your study apply to a specific population you're interested in working with. And this is a challenge that comes up very, very often in the field. If you think back to those wheels of evidence-based practice, there's research evidence, which was, if it's a research study, there was a sample involved, and that sample may or may not represent the population as a whole, and it may or may not represent your population. But you want to know, you have a specific individual or group, and you want to know if this intervention that you're considering is evidence-based, not just in general, not just according to the research evidence, but is evidence-based for that client, for that individual or group. So you're taking into account not just the research evidence, but your clinical expertise and your client's needs and preference and context in order to think about applying that study about an intervention to a specific population or person. So you have a study, and you want to ask yourselves a few things. So where was the study done? Is this geographical location similar or different to yours? And how? What's different about it? So if you're in Boston and you're reading a study for Iowa, we obviously know that Iowa or Ukraine or Germany is different from Massachusetts, is not Massachusetts, right? But how are they different? Is a city like Berlin all that different from Boston? Is a city like Wichita, Kansas, all that different from Boston? And if so, why? What's different about it? So, for example, there's much better public transportation in Berlin, and they have a system of socialized medicine, so more people have access to social work and medical services. That's very different from Boston. However, Wichita, Kansas might also has a similar healthcare system because we're both within the United States, so access in Boston and Wichita might be similar. So not just where it was done, but how this geographical location is different or similar to yours. What was the context? So again, the example of socialized medicine in Germany and in Kenya and in many other places is a different context and a different policy landscape to ours here in the United States. And that has implications for access, and it has implications for how the intervention is delivered. Is the context similar or different to yours? Why? And was the intervention similar or different to yours? So oftentimes words like mentoring, prevention, care, treatment, therapy are very, very general. And so if you're reading a study evaluating prevention or therapy or treatment, how was what was actually done similar to what you're planning to actually do, and how is it different? And then finally, what assumptions are being made by the study authors, and how do you feel about these assumptions? So as you read the study, do you get the sense that the authors, for example, are operationalizing gender as a binary? And if so, how applicable is are the study findings going to be if the authors are making assumptions that are inaccurate or are prejudiced? Do the authors make the assumption that the reason people don't come to appointments is that they're not engaged? Or are they considering other factors that might make it difficult for someone to get to an appointment, like childcare and transportation? How does this align or not align with your own clinical expertise and your own theoretical perspective and beliefs? So you have a study, and that study has a sample. And so when you look at the sample, look at the inclusion criteria and the exclusion criteria. And think about how the sample is similar to your study, to your population, and how it's different. And it's important to think beyond the surface here. So for example, let's say the sample in the study you're reading, the majority of participants were below 50% of the poverty line. And you serve clients, you work at an agency that serves clients that also are below 50% of the poverty line. So on the surface, the population that you serve and the sample in the study are similar because they are both very low income. However, thinking a little bit more deeply, poverty in a rural place and poverty in an urban place can be very, very different and have very different impacts on many things, for example, access to social work services. So if you're thinking about or working with a homeless population in an urban area where everything's very, very close together, and the shelter's down the street from a behavioral health clinic, a group of people who are experiencing homelessness and are below 50% of the poverty line might have fairly good access to social work services, at least in terms of getting to the building. Whereas the same people living in the same condition of being 50% below the poverty line and experiencing homelessness in a rural area, the nearest social work or behavioral health clinic might be, several miles or even several hundred miles away. So people who on the surface are the same might have much less access, at least in terms, again, of getting to the clinic. So along those lines, the sample that in the study might not look exactly like your population. And that's totally okay. That doesn't mean that the sample, that the study's findings aren't generalizable from the sample to your population. It may mean that, but it doesn't necessarily. So just because the sample and your population are different doesn't mean that the findings won't be generalizable. It's okay if the sample in the study and your population are different. And even if, let's say, the match was totally perfect, so in terms of all the characteristics listed, gender, race, ethnicity, income, sexual orientation, gender identity, number of children in the family, even if your population and the sample in the study totally matched each other, the results still wouldn't be exactly the same. So this is one of those puzzles that, I remember from Highlights for Children as a kid. I'm not sure if that magazine's still in circulation, but let's say it was. This is, that kind of puzzle where you have a similar scene, but you'll notice even when the scene's very similar, the sample in the study and your population are very similar, there's still going to be differences. So for example, this red balloon in the playground is not in this playground. And in this playground, we have two little jumpy over hoops. And in this playground, there's three little jumpy over hoops. This person in this playground appears to have a tail of some kind. Maybe it's a handle on the little horse that they're riding. That would make more sense. This person's horse does not have a handle. So, if you keep looking, you'll notice a bunch of other subtle differences between the two situations. No helicopter, for example, in this playground. And this is to say that even if the sample is completely matched, there'll still be differences in context because no one's cloned yet. And contexts have not been cloned yet. So we're never going to have exact similarity. There will always be contextual differences between the sample and your population. So that means that instead, we need to think about the takeaways for your population, and this is really how we determine generalizability. So within within the study sample, were there differences in barriers? So were there barriers that your population is experiencing that weren't present in the study? Going back to that rural-urban example, if you're working in a rural area and the study was done in an urban area, are there barriers that your clients might experience that weren't experienced by the group in the study? And how will that affect whether or not this intervention is effective? Are there differences in facilitators? So is there something that your clients have access to that people in the study didn't have access to? Are there, inherent strengths in your clients or population that weren't talked about in the study? And how might this mean that the findings are different or might need to be modified or applied differently? Does your population have different needs? And how does that change whether or not the findings of the study apply? So if you're doing a study, or you're reading a study, sorry, that shows that meditation practice is an effective way to reduce symptoms of depression in the population that was studied. Is there need among your population? So say you're working with trauma survivors for whom some of the meditation exercises can be re-triggering or scary. Does that mean that in order for you to have the same results in terms of reduced depression symptoms, do you need to find a way to do trauma-informed meditation exercises or trauma-informed yoga in order to see the same benefits, given the different needs of your population from the study samples? And are there differences in policies? So, for example, many of you in your annotated bibliographies read studies that were from different countries, which is totally fine. But were there policies in place in those countries or even in those states that were different from the policies in place that impact your clients and your population? And if so, what does that mean for the findings? So if, for example, you read a study in that came from Australia that showed that giving people bus passes made it easier for them to get to their scheduled screening appointments. Do those findings about giving people in your population bus passes, will they be relevant if our, access to screening facilities is different here? So I want to say I have an important note about racial and ethnic differences between the sample population in the study and your population. And as a content warning, I'm going to be talking about racism for probably the next minute or two. So you can forward ahead to the next slide if you would like. So the first thing I want to note is that we have a lot of good science at this point showing that race is not biological. There are no biological differences among the races, and on average, as a white person, I am more likely to I have more genetic similarities with people of color than I do with other white people. There's more genetic differences within racial groups than there is outside racial groups. And that's a really, well-proven, well-documented scientific fact that at this point really isn't up for debate. However, race is what's called a social construct. So it's something human beings have created and made a lot of systems around. And it has a lot of meaning and a lot of impacts for people. So while I might not be in any way biologically or genetically different from a person of color, I'm exposed to much less of the harms of racism and the stress of racism. So this differential exposure to the harms of racism can have a lot of impacts on our realities, on our health, on our well-being. And in a very practical sense, as a white person, I'm more likely to be offered a mortgage, to be told I've qualified for a mortgage, than a person of color who makes the same salary and has the same savings as I do. I'm more likely to be offered pain medication while I'm waiting in an emergency room with a broken bone. I'm much less likely to experience police brutality in my lifetime. I'm more likely to be taken seriously and given a restraining order when I report domestic violence. So, all of these differences are really, really important. So, in terms of applying studies where the sample is of one racial group or ethnic group to a population of another ethnic group or racial group, we need to think about these differential exposures and these differential life conditions, differential exposures to the stress of racism and differential opportunities and living conditions and systemic biases. So if I'm reading a study where all the participants or most of the participants were people of color, and I'm thinking about applying this intervention or using this intervention in my all-white or mostly white client population. So do these findings apply? Yes, because we're not biologically different. But they might need some modification. So, for example, if the intervention was found to be successful because it was using practices that were trauma-informed and racism-informed, and providing something like, in addition to financial education, advocacy and legal support for people who were denied mortgages for racist reasons. The findings about financial education increasing the likelihood of qualifying for a mortgage might totally apply to your all-white population. But you might not need to offer the legal advocacy because it's so much less likely that white people will get turned down for mortgages based on racism. That doesn't happen. So you might need to modify the program about financial education and advocacy to better serve members of your all-white population, or mostly white population, to really focus on only the financial education piece. But those findings from the study would still be valid. So likewise, let's say you have a study with mostly white participants, and you're working with a population of all people of color, or mostly people of color. So do those findings about the efficacy of financial education in terms of helping people get mortgages and achieve housing stability, do those findings still apply? Yes, they do, because we're not biologically different. But they might need some modification to address the impacts and the harms of racism. So, for example, a study of financial education to help people qualify for mortgages. If the study sample was all white or mostly white, we might need to add in a piece to the intervention that addresses bias in lending and predatory lending practices and racist lending practices so that our participants aren't being blamed or asked to take responsibility for societal conditions that are beyond any individual's control. So adding in a piece about addressing racism on the part of lenders might be wise. But again, we don't need to throw out the findings wholesale because the racial categories of the sample were different from the racial categories of the population we're working with. And what about studies that don't specify racial or ethnic identities of the participants? Do they apply to your population? So I would say yes, again, because we are not biologically different. But we really need to think about the inherent assumptions and privileges involved in taking a colorblind approach. So when we say we don't see color, unless we are actually legitimately colorblind, and I think even then we are, most colorblind people I know can still identify racial categories. when we take a colorblind approach, we're ignoring both the strengths and the beautiful things about people's identities, and that's a problem. And we're also ignoring the differential exposures to racism. We're ignoring really ingrained systems, systems that have really been built into our society from the very beginning. And so that means we're missing a lot of the context in a colorblind approach. So if the authors of a study are taking a colorblind approach and not talking about the racial or ethnic identities of the participants in their study, in their sample, or the racial and racism that's present in the context that their study was conducted in, they might be missing other things. And so we really need to think critically about that, though the findings might absolutely still apply. So, in summary, evaluating generalizability from a study you're reading to a population you're working with is about much more than looking at whether there's an exact match. Because again, even if the match were to be perfect, which is very rare and probably won't happen in our lifetimes, even if the match is perfect, there's still going to be differences in context. So thinking about the context of the study that you're reading and the context of the sample, what are the takeaways? What modifications might be needed? What additional supports might be needed? What strengths and resources can be mobilized? In other words, what parts of the findings apply, and what parts of the results might you need to do the intervention a little bit differently around in order to get the same results.